Hey, hi everyone. So today we'll be looking at a clear code scenario to control service account permission using RBAC. So RBAC is nothing but role-based access control. So based on your feedback, let's get into some theory and understand what is RBAC. So there are concepts like we'll have concepts like role, then role binding, and then cluster role, and then cluster role binding. Okay. So I've tried to summarize, and I will attach this in the description as well. So role is limited to one namespace, and role binding is also limited to one namespace. Then cluster role will be limited to the cluster itself. So it is not a namespace resource. And same with cluster role binding. Even cluster role binding is a cluster wide resource. So let me show you. If you go to kubectl API resources, so you get to see all the resources in Kubernetes, right? So what we'll do is uh, we'll we'll apply a flag called as namespace is equal to true, and we'll search for role. Let's grep role. Okay. So see, role bindings and roles are namespace resources. And if you try to see for cluster, so you don't get anything, right? So cluster role and cluster role bindings are not namespaced. Similarly, if you go to namespaced is equal to false. So now you see we are having cluster role bindings and cluster roles, right? So these two resources are available cluster wide. So they are not namespaced, and role bindings and roles, they are namespaced. So they are not available cluster wide. They are only available in a particular namespace, right? So now we have few combinations, right? Roles and role bindings, then cluster role and cluster role bindings. So now uh, let's get into the diagram. So imagine this is your Kubernetes cluster, right? So you will have namespaces, multiple namespaces, namespace one, namespace two, so on and so forth, right? So a role will be available only in a namespace, and a role binding will also be available in this particular namespace. So if you create a role in namespace one and a role binding in namespace one, so it will not be available in namespace two and namespace three and so on. It will only be available in this particular namespace. So for cluster roles, the cluster role will be available for the entire cluster. So in all the namespaces, 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth, like all namespaces in the cluster, we can use the cluster role. And similarly for the cluster role bindings, it will be available cluster wide in all namespaces. So let's understand the combinations. So see, you can consider a role as a container, like a role and cluster role are containers. So we have a container as a role, and a role binding is an object. So this role is a small, you can say it is a small container because it is only limited to namespace, and role binding is object. It is a small object. So a small object, we can insert this small object into this small container. So it will fit in, right? So this is possible. Now cluster role and cluster role binding. So cluster role is a large object, and cluster role it is a large container, and cluster role binding is a large object. So even this, for this large object, we are having a large container. So we can put the cluster role bindings into these cluster roles. Then we have another combination as cluster role and cluster role binding. So cluster role is a large container and role binding is a small object. So we can put this small object into this large container. So even this condition is possible. But when we come to role and cluster role bindings, so role is a small container and cluster role binding is a large object. So this large object cannot go inside the small container. So the combination of role and cluster role binding is not possible. These three combinations are possible: role binding, cluster role, and cluster role binding. So these are straightforward: role binding, cluster role binding. But we can use we can create a cluster role, and then we can bind it with a role binding. So this is possible because a small object can go inside a large container, but vice versa is not possible, right? This big object cannot go inside a small container. So role and cluster role binding combination is not possible. So now let's get into the scenario, right? So what they're saying is there are existing namespaces NS1 and NS2. So let's get the namespaces. So we are having these two namespaces, right? NS1 and NS2. So now they're saying create service account pipeline in both namespaces. So let's create the service account. kubectl create SA, and we'll copy pipeline in namespace NS1 and we'll create it in ns2 as well. So let's verify kubectl get sa in the namespace ns1, and we have the service account created in the namespace 1. Then we go into the namespace 2, and we have a service account pipeline created in namespace 2 as well. So this task is done. We have created a service account pipeline in both the namespaces. So now what they're saying is these essays like service accounts should be allowed to view almost everything in the whole cluster, right? So you like they must have the permission to view anything in the entire cluster, like not in a particular namespace, but in the entire cluster. And you can use the default cluster role view for this. So they're saying that they're giving us a hint to use the cluster role which is already existing in the system, and the name of the cluster role is view. So let's see kubectl get cluster role, and we will grep for view. So we have this cluster role called as view. So let's describe the cluster role, right? So kubectl describe cluster role view. So see, if you see on all the objects, it is having get, list, and watch permissions. So we can view anything, like we can get, we can list, and we can watch all the objects. Like precisely not all, but almost everything. That's what they're saying, right? View almost everything. So this role, a cluster role view is already present, right? So we don't need to create a new cluster role. We just need to create cluster role bindings. So what they're saying that you this SA should be allowed to view almost everything in the whole cluster. So the SA should be allowed to view everything in the whole cluster. So now we have a cluster role which is already present. So now we'll create a cluster role binding so that we don't need to grow granular wise on the namespaces. So let's create the cluster role binding. So kubectl create cluster role binding. They have not given any specific name, so we can keep it as anything. So cluster role binding, and the cluster role will be view, and the service account is a namespace object, right? So we need to give the namespace. So ns1 colon pipeline, and same again for the another service account. So service account service account is ns2 pipeline, right? So see what we're doing, we are creating a cluster role binding for a cluster role view which is already present, and the name of the cluster role binding is crb, and this is for the service account pipeline in namespace 1, and this is for the service account pipeline in namespace 2, right? So we'll create this cluster role binding, and we have the cluster role binding created. So kubectl get cluster role binding, and we'll grep for crb. So we have this cluster role binding created, right? So now let's verify. So kubectl auth can I get pods as system colon service account, and it will be namespace 1 and pipeline. So yeah, see it is saying yes, so you're allowed to get pods. We'll try it for namespace 2 as well. So you're allowed, right, with namespace 2 as well. So get operation we're allowed to do. Now we'll do try with delete pods, right? So see, I'm not allowed to delete pods as a as a service account pipeline in namespace 2, and same with namespace 1 as well. So yeah, so we can see that we are allowed to view, but we are not allowed to delete, or even will not be allowed to edit as well. So we can verify that as well. But in exam, don't waste much of your time in verification. Just do a very minimal sanity. So see, edit is not a verb, but it's saying no. So we can try with update. So see, they're not saying, they're saying no, that we cannot do an updation or deletion. So we can only list, right? So this second part is also clear. So we are done with this part, that the SAE should have view in almost everything in the whole cluster. And we have used the existing cluster role named view. So now going ahead, they're saying the service account should be allowed to create and delete deployments in their namespace, right? So now we have two namespaces, right? NS1 and NS2. So now if we see, there are two options. We can create a role in both of these namespaces. So we need to create two roles, one role in NS1 and one role in NS2. And then we need to create two role bindings, one for NS1 and one for NS2. So instead of that, what we can do is we can create a cluster role. So cluster role is, by default available in the entire cluster. So it will be available, and then we will create two role bindings in namespace 1 and namespace 2 respectively. So the cluster role will be available in the cluster, but it will be applied only in the NS1, and the another cluster role, another role binding will be applied in the NS2. So let's create a cluster role. kubectl create cluster role, and they're saying to create and delete deployments. Okay, so cluster role create delete deployment crcdd. I'm just giving a short form, and then we need to specify verb as create comma delete, and the resources deployments. So if you don't know the names, or you're afraid of some typo, then you can go to Cube API resources and then get the names, like the correct spellings for the verbs as well as the resources. So the cluster role is created, right? So now we'll create the role bindings in the namespaces. So kubectl create role binding. This is RB1, role binding 1, and we will use the cluster role as crcdd because it is available in the entire cluster, right? But we are applying it only in a particular namespace. So, and the service account will be ns1 colon pipeline, and it will be in the namespace 1. So this is very important because we need to do it in a particular namespace. If we don't specify, then it will go into the default namespace. So then the service account can create and delete this deployments in the default namespace. But what they are saying, the SA should be allowed to create and delete deployments in their namespace. So we need to do it in the namespace 1. So this one is created. We'll do the same thing for, we can keep the same name as well, but we'll change it to RB2, and this one will do in the namespace 2, right? So when this role binding is created, now we can verify kubectl auth can I create deploy in namespace ns1 and system colon service account system colon service account colon ns1 colon pipeline. Can I create deploy? Okay, as we have missed the flag. Yeah, so see, it is saying yes, we can create deployments. We'll check for ns2. We'll check with delete for ns2. Okay, can I delete deploy? Can I delete deploy in namespace ns2 as system service account ns2 pipeline? ns2 create and delete deploy, create delete, right? So can I delete deploy in system service account? No. So let's go into let's describe the role bindings. Okay, kubectl get role binding in namespace ns2. We have this RB2. So kubectl describe role binding RB2 in namespace ns2. Okay, we have a typo here. Describe role binding. Yeah, so it's saying pipeline. Okay, namespace is ns1. So we have, yeah, so see there's an error, right? So see this command, let me copy. Okay, so if you copy paste, right? So see, this is a good example how we can debug in exam if there's some typo, right? So what I've done is the entire command is right. There's one minor error, that this namespace I should do as ns2. So this pipeline account will be is bound to this ns2, right? So instead of ns2 we have taken as ns1. So now if we create, so first we need to delete, right? Because it will give an error. So cubectl delete role binding rb2 in the namespace ns2. Now we'll create a new one and now we'll describe, right? See, now it's saying in the namespace ns2 and service account pipeline, and this is the role. Now we can try the auth. Let's clear the screen. Now we'll try will auth. Kubectl auth, can I delete deploy? Yeah. So see, now we're getting it as yes. So this is how, you know, if something goes wrong in exam, you can anyways do backtracking and then you can debug, right? So we'll try to delete an STS. So it should give no, because we're not allowed to do it. We are only allowed to create and delete deployments. So yeah, it's saying no, right? So let's validate. So if you see, the validation is successful. So the thing is, you just need to remember that the roles are available in a particular namespace, and as well as the role bindings, and cluster roles are available in the entire cluster. They are not namespace resources, and the cluster role bindings are also available in the entire namespace. And you need to remember this analogy, that a role is a small container, role binding is a small object. So a small object can go inside a small container. Cluster role is a large container, cluster role binding is a large object. So a large object can go inside a large container. Similarly, cluster role is a large object, role binding, large container, and role binding is a small object. So small object can go inside big container. But now role is a small object, small container, and role binding is a is a big object. So big object cannot go inside a small container. So that's the analogy you need to remember. So that's it. Thank you for watching.